When we look at the life of Aileen Wuornos, we're not just studying one of America's most infamous female serial killers. We're also confronting a deeply complicated story of abuse, trauma, survival, and the destructive choices she made along the way. Aileen's life has often been told in fragments: her crimes, her trial, her execution. But if we only look at the headlines, we miss the context, the broken childhood, the years of rejection, and the scars of a life spent on the margins of society. Understanding her story doesn't mean excusing it. It means seeing the full picture, which includes the humanity of her victims, the failures of the systems meant to protect her, and the tragic unraveling of her own path. Before we dive into the first part of Aileen Wuornos' life story, I want to pause for just a moment. If you find stories like these fascinating, where true crime intersects with questions of psychology, justice, and the human condition, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. Every comment, every perspective you share matters here, because this isn't just about telling stories. It's about creating a space where we think critically and empathetically about them together. Aileen Carol Pittman, who would later become known as Aileen Wuornos, was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. From the very start, her life was marked by instability and dysfunction. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was only a teenager when she had Aileen and her older brother Keith. Their father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a deeply troubled man with a criminal record, arrested multiple times for crimes against children. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent much of his life in mental institutions and prisons. When Aileen was only a year old, her father was convicted of child molestation and sent to prison, where he later took his own life. She would never truly know him, but his absence, and his violent legacy, was a silent shadow over her life. Her mother, overwhelmed and incapable of raising two children on her own, abandoned Aileen and Keith when Aileen was just 4 years old. Diane left them in the care of their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. This act, while perhaps born of desperation, left Aileen with deep feelings of rejection that would resurface again and again throughout her life. Life with her grandparents was far from stable or nurturing. Lori and Britta struggled with their own demons. Lori was an alcoholic, strict, and often violent. Britta, though somewhat gentler, was herself overwhelmed by the household's chaos. Reports later revealed that Aileen and Keith were often neglected and that Aileen suffered physical abuse at the hands of her grandfather. Growing up in this environment, she quickly learned that love and safety were not things she could depend on. By the age of 11, Aileen was already showing signs of deep emotional and behavioral struggles. She began experimenting with alcohol, smoking, and drugs, mirroring the instability around her. Her need for connection, however, pushed her toward troubling behavior. She began engaging in sexual activity at a very young age, sometimes with boys her own age, sometimes with older men. There are reports that she engaged in sexual encounters with her brother, Keith, an unsettling sign of the blurred and unhealthy boundaries in her world. By the age of 13, Aileen became pregnant. The father of the child was reportedly a man from the neighborhood, much older than her. When she gave birth to the baby boy in 1971, the child was placed for adoption immediately, and Aileen never saw him again. The experience of giving birth so young, only to lose the baby, compounded the feelings of abandonment that had defined her life. She had wanted to keep the baby, but her grandparents insisted otherwise. That same year, her grandmother Britta passed away. With Britta gone, the only buffer between Aileen and her grandfather's anger disappeared. His cruelty became more pronounced, and Aileen felt increasingly unwelcome in the home. By the age of 15, she was essentially homeless. Her grandfather kicked her out, forcing her to fend for herself in the woods near their house. It was around this time that she began trading sexual favors for food, money, and shelter. This survival tactic would become a permanent part of her life, shaping the trajectory of the years to come. By her teenage years, Aileen had fully embraced a transient lifestyle. She spent nights in cars, wooded areas, or abandoned houses. She began hitchhiking, learning quickly that her looks and willingness to sell sex could get her what she needed to survive. But this existence also placed her in constant danger. She faced violence from men, police harassment, and the stigma of being young, homeless, and female. Despite her difficult circumstances, Aileen was not invisible to others. People who knew her in her teens described her as troubled but charismatic, with a volatile temper. She could be warm and funny, but she could also turn angry and defensive at the slightest provocation. These traits, likely rooted in trauma, would follow her throughout her life, often sabotaging her chances at connection or stability. In 1974, when Aileen was 18, her grandfather died, leaving her with no ties to the family home. She began drifting more permanently, traveling across the country, living off sex work, theft, and the generosity of strangers. She was arrested several times during these years for minor offenses like disorderly conduct, drunk driving, and theft. With each arrest, her mugshots revealed a young woman whose face seemed hardened by years of struggle far beyond her age. What is striking about Aileen's early years is how much of her life was shaped by circumstances outside her control: a broken family, abuse, abandonment, and neglect. But what is equally important is how, as she grew, her choices began to mirror the chaos she had endured. The line between victim and perpetrator in her story becomes increasingly blurred as we move forward. Her path was not yet set in stone, but the foundation was already in place: instability, anger, mistrust, and survival through whatever means necessary. These would all play a part in the woman she would become. When Aileen Wuornos turned 18, she was already carrying the scars of a lifetime. Most young adults are just beginning to explore independence, perhaps starting college, entering the workforce, or navigating their first serious relationships. But for Aileen, adulthood was not a fresh start. It was a continuation of the same instability, rejection, and desperation that had defined her childhood. Her teenage years had taught her how to survive on the fringes of society, through sex work, hustling, and sheer stubbornness, and those survival strategies became the blueprint for her 20s. This was the stage of her life when she fully detached from whatever remnants of family she had left and began forging her identity as someone who lived outside of rules, systems, and expectations. As she drifted through her late teens into her 20s, Aileen became increasingly transient. Hitchhiking was her primary mode of transportation, and sex work remained her means of survival. For her, there was no stability in housing or income, no long-term jobs, and no steady friendships. Every day was about finding enough money for food, alcohol, and cigarettes, and every night was about finding somewhere, anywhere, to sleep. At times, this meant staying with acquaintances or lovers she met along the way, but more often it meant cars, woods, or abandoned buildings. Yet, in the middle of this instability, there were moments that might have offered her a way out, moments where she could have chosen a different path. One of the most surprising of these moments came in 1976, when Aileen, at the age of 20, entered into a marriage that briefly promised a very different kind of life. That year, she met and married 69-year-old Louis Gratzfell, a wealthy yacht club president in Florida. Their marriage was shocking not just because of the nearly 50-year age gap, but because of how radically it contrasted with Aileen's life up to that point. Fell was financially secure, socially respected, and deeply rooted in a community far removed from the transient world of hitchhiking and sex work that Aileen knew. For a brief moment, it looked as though she had stepped into a world of stability that could change the trajectory of her life. But Aileen's demons didn't vanish with a wedding ring. Her temper, impulsivity, and mistrust of others quickly surfaced. Within weeks of the marriage, their relationship spiraled into conflict. Reports from the time describe Aileen as volatile, prone to violent outbursts, and unwilling to play the role of a traditional wife. Fell eventually filed for divorce, citing cruelty as his reason. Their marriage was annulled within just 9 weeks, and Aileen was once again alone. This short-lived marriage is telling in several ways. On one hand, it reveals that Aileen had access to a world where, with patience and support, she might have found some stability. On the other hand, it shows how ill-prepared she was for such a shift. The years of abuse and rejection had left her angry and defensive. Trusting others was difficult for her, and the idea of fitting into someone else's expectations especially in a marriage with a wealthy older man, was almost impossible. For Aileen, the marriage wasn't a sanctuary. It was another stage where her inability to reconcile her trauma with the world around her played out in destructive ways. Not long after the end of her marriage, Aileen's legal troubles began to escalate. She had already been arrested as a teenager for minor crimes like underage drinking and disorderly conduct. But her 20s brought a new wave of criminal behavior that showed how unstable her life had become. In 1976, the same year of her marriage, she was arrested for assault after throwing a cue ball at a man's head in a bar fight. Later that year, she was arrested for drunk driving, which led to her being fined and briefly jailed. The following years brought more arrests, theft, forging checks, armed robbery. In 1981, she was arrested in Edgewater, Florida, for armed robbery after stealing $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes from a convenience store while wielding a gun. She was sentenced to prison and served just over a year before being released in 1983. For someone like Aileen, prison was not a deterrent. It was simply another environment of rules, punishments, and authority figures, systems she had been resisting her entire life. When she was released, she quickly returned to her transient lifestyle. For Aileen, survival meant immediate gratification, quick money, alcohol, cigarettes, and temporary companionship. Long-term planning or stability seemed foreign to her, if not impossible. By the mid-1980s, she was living primarily in Florida, surviving through sex work along highways and in small towns. Hitchhiking remained her constant method of transportation, and her lifestyle put her in regular contact with strangers, some of whom would become customers, others potential threats. For Aileen, danger was a daily reality, but it was also a risk she accepted as the price of survival. In 1986, another pivotal moment arrived in Aileen's life. She met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid from Ohio. Tyria, known as Ty to her friends, was the first person in Aileen's adult life with whom she formed a deep and lasting bond. The two met at a Daytona Beach gay bar and quickly became inseparable. For Aileen, Ty represented something she had never truly experienced before: love, acceptance, and companionship without judgment. The two began a relationship that would last several years, with Ty becoming both Aileen's partner and her anchor. But their relationship was complicated by Aileen's lifestyle. Ty worked off and on, but Aileen was the primary provider, and her income came from sex work along the highways of Florida. She would pick up clients, often truckers or men traveling long distances, while Ty waited in motels or cheap lodgings. Aileen later described her actions as sacrifices for the relationship. She endured the dangers of sex work so she could provide for the woman she loved. Despite this, the relationship was not free of conflict. Aileen's volatility and drinking often caused fights between them, and Ty sometimes grew weary of their unstable existence. But for several years, they remained committed to each other. Ty was the closest thing Aileen ever had to a family in her adult life, and this bond would play a significant role in the years ahead, both in Aileen's descent into violence and in her eventual downfall. As the 1980s drew to a close, Aileen's criminal record had grown longer, her drinking heavier, and her trust in the world around her thinner. She carried with her the pain of abandonment, the rage of abuse, and the daily struggles of surviving on the margins. The short-lived hope of stability, whether through her marriage to Phil or through her relationship with Ty, was always overshadowed by her anger, impulsivity, and need to survive at any cost. What we see most clearly in this stage of her life is how Aileen's survival strategies, violence, sex work, and transient living, were now fully ingrained. They weren't temporary measures anymore. They were who she was, and they would eventually lead her down a darker path than anyone around her could have imagined. By the late 1980s, Aileen Wuornos was a woman standing at the edge of a precipice, though perhaps she didn't recognize it at the time. Years of instability had hardened her. Her childhood traumas were compounded by adulthood filled with rejection, arrests, alcohol dependency, and the endless cycle of survival sex work. Yet, in the midst of all this, she had Ty, Tyria Moore, her anchor, her partner, and the person she loved with a fierce intensity. Their relationship gave Aileen both purpose and pressure. She wanted desperately to provide for Ty, to keep her happy, to prove that she could be the one to take care of them both. But the weight of that responsibility also pushed Aileen into a darker space. By the end of the 1980s, her life would shift irreversibly, and she would begin a series of crimes that made her one of the most infamous names in American true crime. Aileen's lifestyle during this period was a grinding loop of hitchhiking, sex work, and hustling for money to pay for food, motels, alcohol, and cigarettes. Every day was uncertain. Some days she could make enough to keep herself and Ty afloat, but other days she returned with little or nothing, fueling arguments and financial desperation. For Ty, the arrangement was often uncomfortable. She was not directly involved in Aileen's sex work, but she benefited from the money it brought in. For Aileen, this dynamic became both a burden and a justification. She believed she was sacrificing herself for the person she loved most, and in her mind, that sacrifice demanded loyalty in return. But the streets were not forgiving. Aileen's work along the highways of Florida was inherently dangerous. The men she encountered were strangers, often transient themselves, and encounters could turn violent. Many of these men looked at her not as a person but as an object, a commodity they could use and discard. For a woman who had been mistreated her entire life, this constant dehumanization fueled her anger and paranoia. Aileen came to see herself as perpetually under threat, even when there wasn't always danger. She began carrying weapons, knives, guns, both for intimidation and self-protection. It's important to understand that Aileen didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to kill. Her violence was the culmination of years of anger, fear, and resentment toward men, shaped by the abuse she suffered as a child and the dangers she faced in her adult life. By 1989, her view of men was fractured. She saw them as predators, threats, and obstacles, and in her mind, eliminating those threats became not just survival but, in some twisted way, justice. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater, Florida. In November 1989, Mallory picked up Aileen while she was hitchhiking. What happened next has been debated and dissected countless times. Aileen would later claim that Mallory assaulted her and that she killed him in self-defense. Investigators, however, argued that Mallory was simply a customer in her sex work, and the encounter turned into murder. Regardless of the specifics, Mallory was shot multiple times, and his abandoned car was found days later. His body was discovered in the woods, riddled with bullets. For Aileen, Mallory's death marked the beginning of something irreversible. Whether she saw it as self-defense or not, she had taken a life. And once that boundary was crossed, it became easier for her to justify future acts of violence. Mallory wasn't painted as an innocent figure. Later reports revealed he had a history of assault, but his death set Aileen on a trajectory that would spiral over the next year. After Mallory, there was no turning back. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen killed at least 6 more men, all of whom she encountered through her work as a hitchhiking sex worker. The victims included construction workers, salesmen, and truck drivers, ordinary men who, for various reasons, stopped to pick her up. Their bodies were later found in wooded areas, and their cars often abandoned or stolen. Aileen typically shot her victims with a .22 caliber pistol, a weapon she carried for protection. The killings followed a disturbingly similar pattern, and while Aileen sometimes claimed self-defense, her actions afterward often contradicted that narrative. She would take the victims' belongings, sometimes pawn their items, and occasionally drive their cars until they broke down or were abandoned. This behavior suggested that her motives weren't always purely defensive. For some, she may have felt genuinely threatened. For others, it may have been anger, opportunity, or the need for money. Throughout this time, Ty remained by her side, though she later claimed she knew little about what Aileen was actually doing. Still, their life together was funded by money and goods that came from Aileen's encounters, and it's hard to believe Ty was entirely unaware of the dangers. What is clear, however, is that Ty represented Aileen's strongest motivation. She wanted to keep Ty in her life, to provide for her, and to prove her worth. But the way she went about it, through violence, was a path that could only end in disaster. What makes this chapter of Aileen's life so haunting is the way her justifications blurred reality. In her mind, she wasn't a predator. She was a woman defending herself against men who wanted to harm her. She saw herself as a victim striking back at a world that had abused her since childhood. In interviews later, she described herself almost like a soldier in a war, fighting back against male violence and exploitation. This mindset made her a complicated figure. On one hand, a woman shaped by trauma, and on the other, a killer whose actions left 7 men dead. By the time 1990 came to a close, the trail of bodies left across Florida had drawn law enforcement into a widespread investigation. The pattern was becoming clear: middle-aged men disappearing after picking up a hitchhiker, their bodies found shot in wooded areas. The authorities began to suspect a single perpetrator, and soon, witness accounts and pawn shop records started to point in one direction: a woman matching Aileen Wuornos' description. As investigators closed in, Aileen's world began to unravel. She had crossed a threshold she could never uncross, and the sense of control she may have felt after the first killing gave way to paranoia and desperation. Law enforcement was closing the net, and it was only a matter of time before Aileen's life on the run came to an end. By 1990, the world Aileen Wuornos had built for herself was starting to crumble. For years, she had drifted along the highways of Florida, hitchhiking, hustling, and doing what she believed she had to do to survive. But the deaths of 7 men left behind a trail of evidence that investigators could no longer ignore. Where Aileen may have seen acts of self-defense or justified violence, law enforcement saw a disturbing pattern: a lone woman targeting men, robbing them, killing them, and leaving their bodies in remote areas. The net was tightening around her, and she didn't even realize how close she was to being caught. The murders, stretching from late 1989 through much of 1990, shared chilling similarities. Each victim was a man who had picked up Aileen while she was hitchhiking. Each was later found shot, abandoned in a wooded area, and often stripped of personal belongings. Their cars were either missing or discovered later, abandoned along highways. The men came from different backgrounds: Richard Mallory, a businessman with a dark history; David Spears, a construction worker; Charles Carskadden, a part-time rodeo worker; Troy Burress, a salesman; Charles Humphreys, a retired Air Force major; Peter Seams, a missionary; and Walter Antonio, a truck driver. These were men who might otherwise never have crossed paths, except for one shared mistake: they stopped to pick up Aileen Wuornos. As bodies turned up across the state, detectives from multiple counties realized they were chasing the same killer. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, local sheriffs, and state investigators pooled resources to connect the dots. Witnesses who had seen a woman with some of the victims described her as rough, blonde, and often in disheveled clothing, hitchhiking along major interstates. Pawn shop records began surfacing with items belonging to the murdered men. Many of those items were traced back to a woman using aliases, but the pawn tickets contained fingerprints. This detail would become critical. At the time, Aileen was still unknown to police as a suspect, but her prints were already on file from her many prior arrests. Once investigators matched the pawn shop prints to Aileen's criminal record, the hunt became focused. They now had a name: Aileen Wuornos. Parallel to this growing law enforcement pressure, Aileen's personal life was deteriorating. Her relationship with Tyria Moore, Ty, was no longer the safe harbor it had once been. Ty had never been fully comfortable with Aileen's dangerous lifestyle, and as the killings escalated, she became increasingly fearful. Ty had lived in a kind of willful denial, benefiting from Aileen's income but avoiding questions about where the money came from. But when the news began reporting on the string of murders across Florida, and when Ty realized the descriptions of the suspect bore an eerie resemblance to her partner, her unease grew into dread. For Aileen, the bond with Ty remained central. She saw herself as the provider, the protector, the one willing to sacrifice everything to keep Ty safe and cared for. But Ty, unlike Aileen, was not hardened against fear. She began to think about her own survival and the risk of being implicated in something she didn't fully control. The stress of living under that shadow strained their relationship. Arguments became more frequent, and Ty reportedly urged Aileen to stop what she was doing. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly. They released composite sketches to the public of the woman seen with victims, hoping for tips. Witnesses described Aileen as aggressive, often drunk, sometimes threatening. She stood out. She wasn't the kind of hitchhiker men expected, and that made her easier to remember. The more the police canvassed, the more her name circulated, and soon they learned of her frequent presence in Daytona Beach, living a transient life in cheap motels and bars. It was in Daytona that detectives decided to make their move. In early January 1991, police set up surveillance around the Last Resort, a biker bar where Aileen was known to hang out. The bar was a fittingly ironic place for her capture. Its very name symbolized the point her life had reached. Officers spent days watching her routine, waiting for the right moment. On January 9, 1991, they arrested her. She didn't resist. Decades of anger, survival, and violence had led to this point, and it was almost anticlimactic. While the arrest was a triumph for law enforcement, it was only half the battle. They still needed a confession, and for that, they turned to the one person who had the most influence over Aileen, Ty. Authorities tracked Ty down in Pennsylvania, where she had returned to live with her family. Fearing prosecution herself, Ty agreed to cooperate with police in exchange for immunity. What followed was a calculated and heartbreaking betrayal for Aileen. Law enforcement arranged for Ty to call Aileen from the police station, with the calls recorded. Over the course of 3 days, Ty coaxed Aileen into confessing, telling her she was terrified of being blamed and needed the truth to protect herself. Believing she was protecting Ty, Aileen admitted to the killings. She framed them as acts of self-defense, claiming that each man had tried to harm or assault her, and that she had no choice but to kill. While this explanation revealed Aileen's perspective, it didn't erase the evidence of robbery and theft tied to the crimes. Nevertheless, her confession sealed her fate. For Aileen, those phone calls were devastating on multiple levels. She had trusted Ty more than anyone else in her life. To her, Ty was family, love, and stability all wrapped into one. The fact that Ty was the person who pushed her to confess was a betrayal that cut deeply, even though Ty's fear was understandable. From a legal standpoint, it was effective. Police now had recorded evidence of Aileen admitting to multiple murders. But from an emotional standpoint, it was the ultimate breaking of the one connection that had meant everything to her. After her arrest, Aileen quickly became a media sensation. The story of a female serial killer was rare, and her case drew international attention. The press painted her as the damsel of death, a broken woman who turned into a predator on the highways of Florida. Interviews with her became frequent, and her volatile personality, swinging between calm, angry outbursts, and tearful defenses, fascinated and horrified the public in equal measure. What made her story even more complex was the way Aileen framed herself. She didn't deny killing the men, but she refused to see herself as a cold-blooded murderer. To her, she was a victim of lifelong abuse who struck back against men who tried to exploit her. In her mind, she was fighting for her life each time she pulled the trigger. This perspective sparked debates that still linger. Was she a serial killer motivated by greed and rage, or a deeply traumatized woman lashing out at a lifetime of abuse? By the time her case moved toward trial, Aileen was trapped in a narrative she couldn't escape. The police had her confession, the pawn shop records tied her to the victim's belongings, and the public was riveted by her story. What lay ahead for her was no longer about survival. It was about navigating a justice system that would determine whether she lived or died. This period, her arrest, the betrayal by Ty, and her confessions, marked the beginning of the end for Aileen Wuornos. She had lived her entire life feeling unwanted, unloved, and constantly fighting against forces she believed were trying to destroy her. Now, with the spotlight on her, she would have to tell her story not just to investigators, but to the world. When Aileen Wuornos was arrested in early 1991, the world she had lived in, a world of highway shoulders, rundown motels, truck stops, and backroads, shifted violently into something she couldn't control. For years, she had been in motion, drifting from place to place, surviving through grit and desperation. Now, she was locked inside a system she neither trusted nor understood. And the system was preparing to put her on trial not just for her life, but for the life stories of the 7 men who had died along Florida's highways. The lead up to her trial was chaotic from the start. Aileen's name had already exploded across newspapers, television, and magazines. She was a female serial killer, something so rare that the media latched on to every detail. Reporters swarmed Daytona Beach and Volusia County. They interviewed bartenders who had seen her at the last resort, acquaintances from her drifting life, and anyone who had even brushed shoulders with her. They dissected her childhood, her relationship with Tyria Moore, and the sheer strangeness of her story. For the press, Aileen wasn't simply a defendant, she was a sensational headline. But behind the spectacle, prosecutors worked methodically. They planned to bring her to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory, the electronics shop owner killed in December 1989. Of the 7 men, Mallory's case was chosen first, partly because his car and personal items had been linked to Aileen, but also because his death was the earliest and served as a foundation for the others. The state hoped that if they could convict her of one murder, they could use that precedent to tackle the rest. A critical point in the case was Aileen's confession. Recorded during those phone calls with Tyria Moore, the confession tied her directly to multiple murders. Aileen insisted she had acted in self-defense, claiming that Mallory had attacked her, that he had tried to sexually assault her, and that she had no choice but to kill him. This claim had some complexity because Mallory himself had a documented history of violence. He had previously served time for sexual assault, a fact the defense hoped to use in Aileen's favor. But the prosecution argued that Aileen's behavior afterward, taking his car, pawning his belongings, and continuing the same pattern with other men, proved that her motive was robbery, not survival. As her trial approached in January 1992, Aileen's emotional state grew increasingly unstable. She veered between moments of calm and explosive outbursts, often lashing out at reporters or muttering angrily in court. To many watching, she seemed erratic, unpredictable, even dangerous. But to those who understood her life, it was clear she was under immense strain, betrayed by Ty, cornered by the justice system, and now performing under the watchful eye of a fascinated public. The trial itself was a spectacle. Courtrooms in Florida had rarely seen such attention for a single case, especially involving a female defendant accused of multiple murders. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of pawn shop owners, fingerprint experts, and witnesses who had seen Aileen with the victims' cars. They painted her as a calculating predator, someone who used her appearance as a hitchhiker and sex worker to lure men before killing them and stealing their belongings. The defense, on the other hand, tried to frame her life story as an explanation. They spoke about her abusive childhood, her years of sexual exploitation, and her belief that she was defending herself in dangerous situations. They argued that Aileen had been fighting back in a world where men often viewed her as disposable. But while these arguments drew some sympathy, the weight of evidence was crushing. The jury wasn't only listening to her story, they were seeing the pattern of 7 dead men and the trail of possessions linking her to each one. During the trial, the prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence of the other murders, even though she was only formally being tried for Mallory's death. This was a devastating blow to her defense. Instead of the jury considering a single act of self-defense, they were asked to view Aileen as someone who had done the same thing again and again, with strikingly similar details. The law permitted it under what's called similar fact evidence, meaning if a pattern of behavior is strongly relevant, it can be presented. For Aileen, this made it nearly impossible to isolate her case around Mallory. The most emotional testimony came from Tyria Moore. Called to the stand, Ty described how Aileen had confessed the killings to her, and how she had been scared of being implicated. For Aileen, seeing Ty in the courtroom must have been devastating. She had once believed that their bond was unbreakable, but here was Ty, cooperating with the prosecution, playing a central role in her downfall. Still, even in that moment, Aileen did not lash out at Ty. perhaps a sign that her feelings for her remained, even as everything collapsed around her. On January 27, 1992, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The next day, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Aileen Wuornos, the drifter who had spent her life surviving on scraps and scraps of kindness, was now sentenced to die by lethal injection. Her reaction to the sentence was defiant. In court, she told the judge that she had been raped, threatened, and harmed by men all her life, and that she had acted in defense. Her words were angry, scattered, sometimes incoherent, but they carried a raw intensity. She seemed less concerned with the verdict than with finally voicing her lifelong resentment against the world she felt had wronged her. But Mallory's trial was only the beginning. Over the next several months, Aileen would face additional trials for the murders of other victims. In each case, the pattern of evidence repeated itself: pawned belongings, witness accounts, and her own confession. She was convicted again and again, ultimately receiving 6 death sentences. Each trial chipped away further at any hope she might have clung to, though she rarely showed fear. Instead, she projected hostility, sometimes even sarcasm, toward the courts and the press. Outside the courtroom, Aileen became a figure of fascination and debate. Was she a cold-blooded serial killer, like Ted Bundy or Richard Ramirez, driven by greed and anger? Or was she something more complicated, a woman shaped by years of abuse, poverty, and trauma, who lashed out violently in moments of fear and rage? Documentaries began to follow her story, journalists flocked to interview her, and filmmakers expressed interest in dramatizing her life. Inside prison, however, she was far from the glare of cameras. Locked in a cell, she cycled between moments of quiet resignation and explosive rants against the system. She gave interviews that swung wildly in tone, sometimes insisting she had acted in self-defense, other times admitting she had killed for money, and at other points expressing apocalyptic visions of conspiracies and spiritual warfare. The contradictions made her even more compelling to the public, but also revealed the psychological toll her life and imprisonment had taken. By the end of 1992, Aileen Wuornos had transformed from an unknown drifter into one of the most infamous women in American criminal history. She had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death multiple times. Her name was etched into headlines and documentaries, her face a symbol of both horror and tragedy. Yet, even as the legal system delivered its verdicts, the question of who Aileen truly was remained unsettled. Was she simply a murderer who preyed on men for survival, or was she a product of a lifetime of abuse who finally snapped? The truth, as always, was tangled somewhere in between. The next chapter in her story would be less about the evidence and more about the aftermath. The years she spent on death row, the media circus that grew around her, and the way she tried to explain herself to a world that was both captivated by and horrified of her. After her sentencing in 1992, Aileen Wuornos entered a new chapter of her life, one that was far removed from the turbulent highways and motels of Florida where she had once survived. Now, she was confined to a stark environment with cinder-block walls, security cameras, and the heavy routine of prison life. Death row at Broward Correctional Institution in Florida became her home, and there she would remain for a decade. For most inmates, that kind of isolation is punishing, but for Aileen, it was an existence that alternated between a strange kind of stability and bursts of paranoia, anger, and loneliness. Death row in Florida was not like the general prison population. Aileen was kept in a small cell for almost the entire day, with only brief periods outside for exercise or showers. Her contact with others was limited: guards, lawyers, and the occasional visitor. In many ways, the conditions stripped away her ability to distract herself with the hustle of survival she had once relied on. Instead, she was forced to sit with her thoughts, her memories, and the crushing knowledge that the state planned to end her life. For someone who had spent decades constantly moving, hitchhiking, hustling, and evading the law, this was an existence that must have felt unbearable at times. Yet, surprisingly, Aileen did not initially collapse under the weight of death row. At first, she gave interviews, wrote letters, and interacted with journalists and documentarians. She seemed to embrace the attention, even though she railed against the media for exploiting her story. There was a contradiction at the heart of her personality. She resented the constant cameras but also seemed to crave being heard, desperate for people to understand her side of things. Her relationship with the media became one of the defining features of her time in prison. Documentaries like Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, both directed by Nick Broomfield, captured her rants, her confessions, and her moments of vulnerability. In front of the camera, she shifted between fury and calm, bitterness and sorrow. One moment, she would insist that every killing had been in self-defense, describing her victims as violent predators who had attacked her. The next, she would bluntly admit that she had killed for money. Then, in another mood, she would claim that the government wanted her dead, that shadowy forces were controlling her fate, and that the system was conspiring to silence her. This volatility became a hallmark of her later years. Some saw it as evidence of her mental instability, post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoia, and perhaps even delusions. Others believed it was her way of trying to wrestle back control over her story. After years of being shaped by abuse, rejection, and poverty, Aileen wanted, at the very least, to define herself in the narrative that the world consumed. Religion also played a role during her years on death row. In 1992, not long after her sentencing, she was baptized by a born-again Christian minister. The ceremony was a highly publicized event, with television cameras capturing her conversion. For Aileen, who had long oscillated between anger at God and a desire for spiritual meaning, this seemed like a turning point. She often spoke about her faith afterward, claiming she had found peace and redemption through Christianity. Some saw this as a genuine expression of her inner transformation, while others suspected it was another way for her to shape how she would be remembered. At the same time, her mental state seemed to deteriorate under the strain of incarceration. She grew increasingly paranoid about the guards at Broward Correctional. In her final years, she accused them of tormenting her with cruel noises, contaminating her food, and manipulating her environment to drive her insane. She claimed they would spray chemicals into her cell and whisper threats. None of these claims were ever substantiated, but they revealed the depth of her distrust. Whether these beliefs were rooted in reality, or in her own psychological unraveling, they consumed her daily life. Her relationships during this time were few but notable. Perhaps the most unusual was with Arlene Prawl, a woman who reached out to Aileen after reading about her case. Arlene, a Christian woman living in Florida, claimed she had received a message from God instructing her to help Aileen. Over time, she became one of Aileen's closest confidants, visiting her regularly, and even legally adopting her as her daughter. Their bond was complicated and often criticized by outsiders, who questioned Arlene's motivations and influence. But for Aileen, who had been abandoned and betrayed so often in her life, the relationship may have provided a measure of comfort, however unconventional. Another defining factor of her prison years was her growing frustration with the legal system. By the late 1990s, she was no longer interested in appeals or fighting her death sentences. She told lawyers and journalists that she wanted to die, that she was tired of living in the cage of death row. In fact, she took active steps to speed up her execution, waiving her right to further appeals in 2001. For her, the endless cycle of court hearings and media coverage seemed pointless. She wanted an end, and she wanted it on her own terms. Her decision to abandon appeals raised serious ethical questions for those involved in her case. Was she competent enough to make such a decision? Was her desire to die a reflection of rational thought, or was it a product of her deteriorating mental health and years of trauma? Psychiatrists were called in to evaluate her, and ultimately she was deemed competent, though even this decision was controversial. As the execution date drew closer, Aileen's statements became increasingly erratic. In interviews, she accused prison staff of psychological torture, claimed her food was being tampered with, and suggested the authorities wanted to drive her to suicide rather than formally execute her. At one point, she alleged that they were trying to control her with sonic pressure. To outsiders, these claims sounded bizarre and unhinged, but to Aileen, they were real. They reflected a mind that had been fractured by decades of instability, betrayal, and confinement. Despite the paranoia and anger, there were also quieter moments. In interviews, she sometimes spoke with sadness about her life, acknowledging the abuse she had suffered as a child and the choices she had made as an adult. She admitted that she had hurt people but insisted that she had been pushed into a corner by a cruel world. These moments revealed a different side of Aileen, still angry, but also deeply wounded, still searching for meaning in the face of her impending death. Throughout her years on death row, Aileen remained a figure of fascination. Books were written about her, journalists analyzed her psyche, and her story became the subject of films and television shows. In 2003, the movie Monster, starring Charlize Theron, brought her life to an even wider audience, though Aileen would never live to see it released. The film portrayed her as both brutal and broken, capturing the contradictions that had made her story so compelling. By the time her execution was scheduled for October 2002, Aileen had become more than just a criminal in the eyes of the public. She was a symbol, though of what depended on who you asked. To some, she was a predator who murdered innocent men. To others, she was a victim of systemic abuse who lashed out in the only way she knew how. And to a few, she was a tragic figure, caught between survival and destruction, shaped by a world that had given her few chances at love, safety, or dignity. The final months of her life were marked by interviews that swung between fury and despair. She railed against the legal system, the media, and the prison staff. She seemed exhausted by the constant scrutiny, yet unable to stop talking. In one interview, she declared that she was sailing with the rock, and that the world would soon see the truth. These cryptic statements only deepened the sense that her grip on reality was slipping. Still, as the execution date approached, Aileen seemed determined to face it head-on. She had spent much of her life running, from abuse, from poverty, from the law, but now there was nowhere left to run. In her own way, she seemed to accept that. She had told her lawyers, repeatedly, that she was ready, that she wanted it to be over. And whether those words were born of peace or despair, they carried the weight of a lifetime lived on the margins. By 2002, after 10 years on death row, Aileen Wuornos was no longer the same person who had walked into a Florida courtroom in chains in 1992. She was harder, more paranoid, and more erratic, but she was also more exposed, her life story laid bare for the world to see. Death row had not transformed her into someone new. It had simply magnified the contradictions, the trauma, and the anger that had always defined her. Her execution was now a matter of months away, and with it, the final chapter of her turbulent journey. By the beginning of 2002, the story of Aileen Wuornos had stretched far beyond the walls of Florida's prisons. She had been the subject of endless news reports, books, documentaries, and debates. She had lived 10 years on death row, her face and voice becoming familiar to the public through repeated interviews and televised specials. Yet as her execution date crept closer, the spotlight on her life burned brighter. It was not simply the end of a criminal case. It was the culmination of a complicated, tragic, and deeply human story that many still struggled to fully understand. The months leading up to her scheduled execution were charged with tension, not just for Aileen but for those who observed her life with fascination. Journalists lined up to speak with her, and prison officials prepared for the inevitable surge of attention. But for Aileen herself, the countdown had a different weight. She had already waived her appeals, insisting she was ready to die, and she spoke of execution as though it were a relief rather than a punishment. To her, living on death row, confined to a cage, subject to the monotony of institutional life, and surrounded by what she claimed was cruelty and harassment, had become intolerable. Yet, in these final months, her behavior and her statements only grew more erratic, feeding speculation about her mental state. In interviews with filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who had documented her life on more than one occasion, she alternated between calm reflections and furious outbursts. Sometimes she would insist that her killings had been entirely in self-defense, painting herself as a victim of predatory men. At other times, she admitted openly that robbery had motivated her. And then there were moments when she veered into conspiracy theories, accusing the prison system of torturing her with sonic weapons, contaminating her food, and manipulating her surroundings to make her appear insane. These claims disturbed many observers. Some dismissed them as delusional rantings, the product of years of trauma and isolation. Others believed they revealed the extent of her paranoia and untreated mental illness. Psychologists who studied her case often pointed to her childhood abuse, abandonment, and early exposure to violence as the roots of her instability. Whatever the cause, by 2002 Aileen's interviews were filled with a raw intensity that could be unsettling to watch. She seemed deeply wounded, perpetually angry, and yet oddly resigned to her fate. One of the central figures in her life during this period was still Arlene Prawl, the woman who had befriended and adopted her years earlier. Prawl remained a supporter and confidant, visiting Aileen and publicly defending her. Their relationship remained unusual and often controversial, with critics questioning Prawl's motivations. Was she genuinely compassionate, or was she drawn to the attention that came with being tied to such a notorious figure? Regardless, Aileen appeared to find comfort in the connection. For someone who had felt abandoned by nearly everyone else, that bond mattered. At the same time, her relationship with her lawyers grew strained. By waiving her appeals, Aileen placed her defense team in an ethically difficult position. Lawyers are trained to fight for life, to exhaust every possible legal avenue. But their client was actively asking them to stop. She accused them of betraying her, of working against her, and of being complicit in what she claimed was government corruption aimed at silencing her. Some of these accusations seemed to stem from her paranoia, but others reflected her genuine frustration with the system she believed was rigged from the start. Her final statements about the legal system were filled with bitterness. She accused the courts of being unfair, the prosecutors of lying, and the police of being corrupt. In her mind, she had been railroaded from the moment she was arrested. She spoke often of injustice, even as she admitted to taking lives. It was this contradiction, between confession and denial, between acceptance and defiance, that made her story so difficult to pin down. Meanwhile, the public remained divided. Some saw her execution as justice for the men she killed, an appropriate punishment for her crimes. Others viewed it as the tragic end of a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering throughout her life, only to lash out in violent desperation. Still others believed her execution was less about justice and more about silencing a figure who had become too much of a spectacle. Whatever the perspective, few people remained indifferent. As her execution date approached in October 2002, Aileen gave some of her most famous interviews. Sitting across from journalists, she spoke with a mixture of fury and eerie calm. She accused the prison guards of tormenting her, claimed she was being set up, and declared that she wanted her life to end. To some, she sounded like a woman at peace with her decision. To others, she seemed broken, desperate, and unraveling. Her paranoia about prison officials reached a fever pitch. She insisted that guards were deliberately trying to break her down psychologically, that they were harassing her daily with noises and threats. She claimed they were tampering with her food and water. She also suggested that shadowy forces outside the prison were involved, hinting at government conspiracies and larger plots. For those who studied her behavior, these comments underscored her fragile mental state. But for Aileen, they were expressions of a reality she believed she was living. At the same time, she occasionally spoke with remarkable clarity about her life and choices. She admitted that she had killed, that she had robbed her victims, and that she knew what she had done was wrong. But she also reminded anyone who would listen of the abuse she had endured throughout her life, abuse at the hands of family members, strangers, and society itself. In her mind, she had never stood a chance. Life had pushed her into a corner, and her crimes were the result of decades of mistreatment. These statements revealed the deep well of pain she carried, even in her final days. In early October 2002, she was moved to Florida State Prison in Rayford, where executions were carried out. The transfer marked the final stage of her journey. The prison prepared for the event with the routine it had followed many times before. Arrangements were made for witnesses, the chamber was readied, and officials confirmed the schedule. Yet despite the routine, there was nothing ordinary about Aileen Wuornos' case. On October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. She was 46 years old. In the hours leading up to her death, she refused a last meal, instead requesting only a cup of black coffee. Her final words were cryptic, referencing outer space and a promise to return. They baffled many, leaving a sense of mystery about what she truly believed in her final moments. Some saw them as evidence of her unstable mind, while others viewed them as her last act of defiance, ensuring that she would remain an enigma until the very end. Her execution sparked a wave of public reaction. Some families of her victims expressed relief that justice had finally been served. Others watched with sadness, reflecting on the cycle of abuse and violence that had shaped her life. Advocacy groups debated whether executing someone with such a troubled history of trauma and mental illness was just or ethical. And the media continued to analyze her, producing countless articles, specials, and documentaries that attempted to answer the question, who was Aileen Wuornos, really? The truth is, she was not easily defined. She was a murderer, yes. But she was also a survivor of horrific abuse, a woman who had been failed by nearly every system that might have protected her. She was both predator and prey, victim and villain. Her story was messy, tragic, and deeply human. Even after her death, Aileen remained a subject of fascination. Films like Monster, which won Charlize Theron an Academy Award, kept her story alive in popular culture. Documentaries revisited her case, and books continued to explore the complexities of her life. In many ways, her legacy was shaped as much by the narratives told about her as by her own words and actions. She became more than a criminal, she became a symbol, though what she symbolized depended entirely on who was telling the story. In her last months, Aileen Wuornos revealed the raw contradictions that defined her life: anger mixed with sadness, paranoia alongside moments of clarity, and a desire for death coupled with an unyielding need to be heard. Her final chapter was as chaotic and haunting as everything that had come before. For those who watched her story unfold, it was a reminder of the complexity of human lives, the lasting impact of trauma, and the uncomfortable truth that justice and tragedy often coexist. After Aileen Wuornos' execution in October 2002, the world's fascination with her story did not end, it evolved. Her life, crimes, and final months on death row continued to spark debates, documentaries, and cultural examinations. For some, she remained the chilling figure of a female serial killer, her crimes shocking in their rarity and brutality. For others, she became a lens through which to explore systemic failure, trauma, and the cyclical nature of abuse. Part 8 of her story examines how her life has been interpreted, memorialized, and discussed since her death, and how the public has grappled with the uncomfortable questions her existence raised. Immediately following her execution, the media coverage was intense and polarized. Mainstream news outlets focused heavily on the criminal elements of her story, recounting her killings and emphasizing her unusual status as a female serial killer. This narrative highlighted the extremity of her actions and cast her as an aberration, a cautionary tale of violence and depravity. Yet alongside the crime-focused coverage, some journalists and commentators explored the circumstances that shaped her life: a childhood of neglect and abuse, early exposure to sex work, and repeated brushes with the law. These accounts began to introduce nuance into the public perception of Wuornos. Books and documentaries were quick to follow. Nick Broomfield, who had been documenting her life since the late 1990s, produced Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, a documentary that presented a critical perspective on both Wuornos and the media machinery surrounding her. The film argued that she had been sensationalized, her life and crimes turned into entertainment at the expense of nuanced understanding. Broomfield's documentary highlighted the intersection of crime, media spectacle, and ethics, raising questions about how society consumes stories of violence. The release of Monster in 2003, starring Charlize Theron as Wuornos, further cemented her presence in popular culture. The film humanized her in a way few other portrayals had, focusing on her trauma and isolation rather than just her crimes. Theron's performance won widespread acclaim and brought Wuornos' story to audiences who might never have read the news articles or legal reports about her. This cultural attention sparked debates about morality and empathy. Could a woman who had killed multiple men ever be forgiven or understood? Was it possible to separate the trauma she experienced from the violence she enacted? Academics and social commentators began to examine Wuornos' life through lenses such as psychology, criminology, and feminism. Some argued that her story exposed the failures of social systems, foster care, mental health care, law enforcement, and societal protections for vulnerable women. Others focused on the gendered aspect of her crimes, noting that female serial killers are far less common and are often treated differently by media and society. In addition to media portrayals, Wuornos' story became a focal point in discussions about the death penalty. Advocates for abolition used her case to illustrate the potential ethical dilemmas of executing someone with a documented history of abuse, trauma, and mental instability. They argued that her life story revealed the complexities of human behavior that are often ignored in legal proceedings. Critics of the death penalty highlighted that Wuornos' psychological state, combined with decades of abuse, could have mitigated the ethicality of her execution. Meanwhile, supporters of capital punishment viewed her execution as a necessary act of justice, emphasizing the need to hold her accountable for her victims. These debates continue to this day, with Wuornos frequently cited as a case study in discussions about criminal justice, gender, and trauma. Her story also impacted the way female criminality is understood. Historically, female killers were often portrayed as motivated by passion or domestic conflict, but Wuornos' case challenged those assumptions. She committed premeditated killings against strangers, often men who had approached her in vulnerable situations. This defiance of traditional gender expectations forced society to confront uncomfortable realities about female violence and the ways trauma can manifest differently across genders. Scholars in criminology and psychology began to explore her case not just for its sensational aspects, but for the insights it provided into human behavior under extreme conditions. Beyond academia, Wuornos became a figure in subcultures and online communities. Websites, forums, and fan groups emerged that analyzed her life in detail, debated her motives, and discussed her legacy. Some communities expressed sympathy, focusing on her trauma and systemic failures that contributed to her path. Others remained fascinated by the darker aspects of her story. This phenomenon illustrates how public figures, particularly notorious criminals, can become cultural touchstones, sparking conversations that extend far beyond their immediate actions. Wuornos' presence in internet culture reflects society's complicated fascination with crime, morality, and survival. Yet despite all the media attention and analysis, the human element remained central. Wuornos was not a symbol or a statistic. She was a person who had lived through unimaginable hardship and whose choices reflected a lifetime of suffering. Books, interviews, and documentaries increasingly emphasized this point, humanizing her without excusing her crimes. Experts noted that understanding her background, her exposure to abuse, the instability of her upbringing, and the pressures she faced as a young woman navigating sex work, was crucial to comprehending the trajectory of her life. One striking element of her posthumous legacy is the discussion of mental illness. Wuornos reportedly suffered from borderline personality disorder and possibly other undiagnosed conditions. Her paranoia, rage, and impulsivity can be interpreted through this lens, raising questions about how society addresses mental health, especially in individuals with traumatic histories. Advocates argue that earlier intervention, therapy, or support might have altered the course of her life, highlighting systemic failures in both mental health care and criminal justice. Cultural representations of Wuornos, particularly in film and literature, often grappled with these tensions. They tried to balance the horror of her crimes with the empathy elicited by her early life experiences. These portrayals were controversial. Critics accused some adaptations of glamorizing or romanticizing her, while supporters argued that they provided much-needed context and perspective. Regardless of the approach, her story remained a lens through which broader social issues, gender, abuse, justice, and trauma, could be explored. Wuornos' story has also prompted discussions about media ethics. Journalists covering her case sometimes faced criticism for sensationalizing her image, emphasizing her appearance or behavior in ways that overshadowed serious analysis of her life. Documentaries like Broomfield's questioned whether the media's portrayal of her contributed to the public's fascination with violence, and whether it exploited her for profit. These debates have influenced how future high-profile criminal cases are covered, emphasizing the need for ethical storytelling that balances truth, context, and respect for victims and perpetrators alike. For survivors of trauma, Wuornos' life offers a complex case study. It's a reminder of the long-term impact of abuse and neglect, the dangers of untreated mental illness, and the consequences of living in a society that can fail its most vulnerable members. Her story is tragic, not just because of the lives she took, but because of the system's inability to protect her, nurture her, or intervene before she turned to violence. Even 2 decades later, her legacy continues to resonate. New books, documentaries, and discussions emerge regularly, often in the context of broader conversations about gender-based violence, criminal psychology, and capital punishment. Psychologists, criminologists, and cultural critics alike continue to study her case, not for sensationalism, but to understand the deeper social and psychological dynamics at play. Aileen Wuornos has become a figure whose life, though tragic and violent, serves as a mirror reflecting society's failures, biases, and capacity for both cruelty and compassion. In sum, the story of Aileen Wuornos after her death is one of cultural examination, ethical debate, and reflection on systemic failures. She is remembered not only as a murderer but as a product of her circumstances, a woman shaped by trauma, and a figure whose life prompts difficult but necessary conversations about justice, mental health, and society's treatment of vulnerable individuals. In the years after Aileen Wuornos' execution, her presence in the cultural imagination did not fade, it transformed. Rather than simply disappearing into the archives of true crime history, her life continued to surface in books, films, academic journals, and even internet communities, each retelling layering new interpretations over the old. The fascination was not merely about the murders she committed, but about what her existence seemed to represent, a collision of trauma, gender, crime, and justice that challenged neat narratives. While some people remember her primarily as a violent criminal, others regard her as a symbol of society's failures, a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about how abuse, neglect, and untreated mental illness can shape the course of a human life. Part of what makes her story endure is that it refuses to sit comfortably in one category, either villain nor victim, either cautionary tale nor tragedy, but something that holds elements of all of these at once. Cultural portrayals of Wuornos took on a life of their own, shaping how the public continued to think about her. The film Monster in 2003, with Charlize Theron's Oscar-winning performance, remains one of the most impactful depictions of her. The movie didn't simply recount the killings. It wove her trauma and desperation into the story, asking viewers to see the woman behind the violence. For many, this was their first introduction to Wuornos, not through news reports or court documents, but through a sympathetic cinematic lens. The film sparked heated debates. Some critics accused it of romanticizing a serial killer, while others argued it finally gave nuance to a woman who had otherwise been reduced to headlines. This duality set the tone for nearly every portrayal of Wuornos that followed. In documentaries, television shows, books, and podcasts, she oscillated between monster and martyr, human being and cultural symbol, depending on who was telling the story. Outside of Hollywood, her story became fertile ground for true crime media. Documentarians like Nick Broomfield, who had followed her case for years, returned to her life with an eye on media exploitation itself. His work argued that Wuornos was not only a subject of fascination but also a victim of how her story was packaged and sold. Other creators went in the opposite direction, focusing on the grisly details or the rarity of a female serial killer, treating her as an anomaly in criminal history. The sheer variety of portrayals illustrates how Wuornos became less a person and more a canvas, onto which society projected its fears, biases, and curiosities. Academia, too, found in Wuornos a complex case study. Criminologists examined her through the lens of gender, noting how her actions disrupted long-held assumptions about female killers. Historically, Women who killed were framed as acting out of passion, revenge, or in domestic contexts. Wuornos, by contrast, targeted strangers, mostly men who had solicited her for sex. This forced criminologists to rethink gendered theories of crime, to consider how trauma, survival, and mental illness might manifest in ways that don't conform to stereotypes. Psychologists analyzed her through diagnoses such as borderline personality disorder and antisocial tendencies, exploring how her childhood abuse and neglect had contributed to the volatility of her adult life. Sociologists pointed to her case as an example of systemic failure, how institutions like foster care, mental health services, and social support had failed to catch her before she fell through every possible crack. In classrooms and research papers, Wuornos was not merely a criminal but a prism through which to study society itself. Her story also resonated in feminist discourse, though not without controversy. Some argued that she represented the inevitable outcome of a society that exploits and brutalizes women, especially those in vulnerable positions such as sex work. To them, her violence was both abhorrent and understandable, a twisted reflection of the violence she had endured throughout her life. Others cautioned against elevating her to a feminist symbol, pointing out that her actions took innocent lives and should not be excused or reframed as empowerment. This tension made her a lightning rod in discussions about gender, power, and victimhood. Wuornos seemed to embody the uncomfortable truth that victims of abuse can, in turn, become perpetrators of violence, a cycle that complicates simplistic ideas about good and evil. Beyond academia and activism, Wuornos' story seeped into the fabric of pop culture and subcultures alike. Songs referenced her, art installations depicted her, and internet communities dissected her life endlessly. Online, she became the subject of forums, fan pages, and debates, some of which treated her with surprising sympathy while others reveled in her notoriety. This digital fascination reflected a broader cultural trend, the blending of crime and entertainment. Wuornos was discussed not only in criminology textbooks but also in podcasts, memes, and late-night conversations, her name carrying a strange mix of horror and intrigue. The internet amplified this fascination, allowing her to become both mythologized and deconstructed in real time. Central to all these portrayals was the persistent question of morality and empathy. How much of Wuornos' violence could be attributed to her traumatic past, and how much to personal choice? Could someone who endured decades of abuse ever be understood, or even forgiven, once they crossed the line into murder? These questions, though unanswerable, kept her story alive in the public imagination. For every portrayal that condemned her as a ruthless killer, there was another that asked viewers or readers to consider the long shadow of trauma. In this way, Wuornos' legacy lies not in any single interpretation but in the tension between competing ones. She forces us to grapple with the limits of empathy and the boundaries of justice. The debates surrounding her execution also became a touchstone in conversations about capital punishment. For opponents of the death penalty, Wuornos' case illustrated the moral and ethical dilemmas of executing someone who was both deeply damaged and mentally unstable. They argued that her life story revealed how punishment often fails to account for trauma and mental illness. Supporters of the death penalty, on the other hand, emphasized the lives she had taken and the need for justice. Wuornos thus became a symbol in the broader fight over capital punishment, her name invoked alongside other high-profile cases to highlight the complexities of justice in a flawed system. Mental health advocates, too, found her story deeply relevant. Her documented struggles with paranoia, rage, and instability were reminders of the consequences of untreated psychological disorders. Her case sparked renewed discussions about how society identifies and treats people with serious mental health challenges, particularly those who have experienced profound abuse. Advocates argued that her trajectory might have been altered if she had received consistent support earlier in life, underscoring the gaps in mental health infrastructure that still exist today. Perhaps what lingers most about Wuornos' legacy is the way she resists simple categorization. For some, she is irredeemably monstrous. For others, she is a tragic victim of circumstance. The truth, as with most human stories, lies somewhere in between. She was capable of terrible violence, Yet her life story reveals a past shaped by suffering, instability, and neglect. This duality ensures that her name continues to surface whenever society examines the intersections of trauma, justice, and gender. 2 decades after her death, Wuornos remains one of the most infamous female killers in history, not just because of what she did, but because of what her life represents. She embodies society's fascination with crime, its unease with female violence, and its failure to protect those most at risk. Her story is not one that provides easy lessons or moral clarity. Instead, it serves as a reminder of the complexities of human behavior, the impact of trauma, and the ways society both consumes and creates the narratives of those who live on its margins. In the end, Aileen Wuornos' legacy is not confined to court transcripts or crime reports. It is alive in classrooms, films, debates, and cultural memory. Her story continues to challenge, disturb, and provoke reflection, reminding us that behind every sensational headline lies a human being shaped by forces far greater than themselves. She may be gone, but the conversations she sparked about justice, morality, trauma, and empathy remain as pressing today as they were on the day of her execution. Aileen Wuornos' story is one that does not rest easily in the past. Even decades after her execution, her life continues to be examined, re-examined, and reframed. She remains a name that provokes recognition, debate, and discomfort, not because her crimes were the most numerous or the most gruesome in history, but because of what her existence seemed to represent. Wuornos' trajectory, from an abusive childhood to sex work on Florida's highways, from a string of murders to death row, embodied a collision of pain, rage, survival, and destruction. The legacy she left behind is both haunting and instructive, raising questions about justice, trauma, and the way society treats its most vulnerable. Looking back at her life in full, it is impossible to separate the violence she committed from the violence she endured. Born into instability, neglected by her family, and subjected to repeated abuse, Wuornos grew up in an environment that stripped away her sense of safety and belonging. By the time she was a teenager, she was already surviving through sex work, trading her body for money, food, or shelter. She had no reliable support system, no stable home, and no opportunities to build a future outside of the margins. For many observers, this backdrop of neglect and exploitation makes her later choices, while not excusable, at least comprehensible. Wuornos was a woman who had been conditioned to expect cruelty from the world, and in turn, she lashed back with cruelty of her own. Her murders between 1989 and 1990 shocked Florida and the country at large, not only because of their brutality but because they challenged expectations about who commits such crimes. Female serial killers are rare, and those who kill strangers even rarer still. Wuornos targeted men who had solicited her, men who encountered her on lonely stretches of highway. Her claims of self-defense, of being attacked or threatened by these men, complicated the narrative, leaving room for doubt and debate. Was she a predator lying in wait, or a survivor striking out in fear? The evidence suggested patterns of premeditation, but her insistence that she had been defending herself from sexual violence resonated with those who saw her as the embodiment of a system that fails to protect women. The truth, as always, seemed to live in the gray areas, murky and unsettling. Her trial and eventual conviction became as much about her image as about the crimes themselves. Wuornos' outbursts in court, her volatility, and her inability, or unwillingness, to present herself as sympathetic reinforced the perception of her as unstable, dangerous, and irredeemable. Yet behind the spectacle, there were troubling questions about her mental state, her access to effective legal representation, and the broader circumstances of her life. Some critics argued that the trial reduced her to a caricature of female monstrosity, emphasizing her anger and rough demeanor as much as the evidence. Others saw her behavior as proof of her inherent violence, her refusal to conform to societal expectations of female composure sealing her fate as much as her actions did. On death row, Wuornos became both more human and more enigmatic. Interviews revealed her shifting moods, moments of startling vulnerability, flashes of rage, and stretches of paranoia. She expressed a deep distrust of others, often believing she was the target of conspiracies. while at the same time showing glimpses of longing for connection. Her relationship with her childhood friend Dawn Botkins, who remained in contact until the end, provided a rare tether to humanity in an otherwise isolating environment. Still, as the years dragged on, Wuornos' mental health seemed to deteriorate. By the time of her execution in 2002, many questioned whether she had the stability to comprehend what was happening. Her final statements before her death only deepened the sense of ambiguity. She spoke of coming back after death, of a higher purpose, of conspiracies and cosmic justice. For some, this was the rambling of a disturbed mind. For others, it was a final act of defiance, a refusal to be reduced to a criminal stereotype even in her last breath. Her execution by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, closed the legal chapter of her story but opened the door to endless interpretation. In the aftermath, the debates about Wuornos' life and death intensified. She was alternately vilified and humanized, studied and sensationalized. Documentaries like Nick Broomfield's works question not just Wuornos' life but the way her story was packaged and consumed by the public. Hollywood transformed her into a tragic antihero and monster, sparking conversations about empathy, representation, and the ethics of dramatizing real-life violence. Academics dissected her case for what it revealed about gender, crime, and systemic failure. Each retelling added new layers, but none provided final answers. One of the enduring reasons her story continues to resonate is that it forces society to look at the connections between trauma and violence. Wuornos is a stark example of how abuse can ripple across a lifetime, shaping not only an individual's sense of self but their actions in the world. The brutality she experienced as a child and young adult left scars that never healed, scars that may have contributed to her inability to trust, to regulate her emotions, to envision alternatives to violence. While not everyone who experiences trauma becomes violent, her case underscores how untreated pain can fester, sometimes with catastrophic results. For mental health advocates and social workers, Wuornos' life is a reminder of the costs of neglect and the urgency of intervention. Her case also continues to shape conversations about the death penalty. Was executing a woman like Wuornos an act of justice or an indictment of a justice system unable to address complexity? She was undeniably guilty of multiple murders, but she was also undeniably a product of extreme trauma and instability. To many, putting her to death felt less like justice and more like the system washing its hands of someone it had already failed. To others, the execution was the necessary conclusion to a case that left several men dead. This unresolved debate ensures that Wuornos remains a touchstone in discussions of capital punishment, invoked whenever questions arise about the morality of the ultimate penalty. The fascination with Wuornos also reveals something about society's relationship with female criminality. She was not the first woman to kill, but she became one of the most infamous, in part because she so clearly defied expectations. She was not a domestic killer, nor a poisoner, nor a woman who killed for financial gain. She was violent, confrontational, and unapologetic, embodying traits traditionally associated with male killers. This disruption of gender norms made her both fascinating and frightening to the public. She became a symbol of the possibility that women, too, could commit the kind of violence society prefers to imagine as exclusively male. At the same time, the public's fixation on her appearance, demeanor, and sexuality revealed deep gender biases. Male killers are often analyzed in terms of their psychology, their methods, or their motives. Wuornos, by contrast, was often reduced to her lack of femininity, her roughness, her inability to conform to societal ideals of womanhood. This scrutiny underscored the ways in which gender shapes the narratives of crime and justice, revealing double standards that continue to persist. 2 decades later, Aileen Wuornos is both a cautionary tale and a cultural figure whose story has been retold countless times. She represents the intersection of personal tragedy and public violence, a life shaped by forces beyond her control yet also defined by choices that took lives. Her legacy is uncomfortable precisely because it resists resolution. She cannot be neatly categorized as monster or victim, nor can her story be fully explained by either trauma or cruelty alone. She was both and neither, a human being whose life compels reflection rather than closure. Ultimately, the significance of Aileen Wuornos' story lies not just in the crimes she committed but in what her life reveals about society itself. It exposes the failures of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, the biases in how we perceive female violence, the limitations of the justice system in addressing complexity, and the ways trauma can echo across generations. Her story continues to ask hard questions about empathy, about accountability, about how much of a person's life is shaped by circumstance and how much by choice. These are questions with no easy answers, but they are necessary ones. In death, as in life, Wuornos remains a figure who resists simplification. Her legacy endures not because she was the most prolific or cunning of killers, but because her life embodies the entanglement of suffering and violence, victimhood and perpetration. To study her is to confront the uncomfortable truth that society often creates the very monsters it condemns, and to reckon with the human cost of neglect, abuse, and indifference. Aileen Wuornos is gone, but the echoes of her life, and the questions it raises, are still with us, demanding not resolution, but reflection.